Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome you to our special Sunday evening event about the Russian disinformation narratives. And with me in the studio, very distinguished guest, Paweł Pawłowski, head of Foundation Council of Warsaw Institute and also member of the Foundation Council of the Central and Eastern European Council Foundation. Welcome, Paweł. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Good evening. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very happy we can talk today on Russian, and not only Russian, but mainly Russian disinformation, as I suppose.
Yes, exactly. Very good guess, Paweł. The title cannot tell you exactly what would be our topic, but exactly we will be talking about the Russian disinformation. So maybe let's start directly. So what do you think, what is the distinctive feature of the Russian disinformation?
Well, it's hard to tell if there is one feature that differentiates Russian disinformation from the others, especially when we think that Russian disinformation differs in different countries of the Central and Eastern Europe. For instance, we have different societies, different topics that are important for people living, for example, in Poland or in Slovakia, Bulgaria. Completely different narratives, completely different means to influence the societies, influence local politics and governments. So I think it would be very hard to say that there is one distinguished feature that differentiates Russian disinformation from the others. So I'm not sure if this is the answer you were looking for, but this is the answer I am willing to give you. So yeah, Liana, I'm sorry.
Well, I'm totally fine with that answer, but I believe that Russian disinformation can be somehow compared to those Russian matryosh. I don't know if it's the correct word in English, but even if you're, let's say, digging for another information that was spread by some kind of a Russian source, okay, you're going into another one, smaller, matryosh. So it's like the circle that we cannot actually leave. So that's why I think
there is whole chain of different entities that spread that disinformation. Is very hard to tell what's the source, especially because these primary sources are oftentimes deleted just because they don't want us to see where this disinformation is coming from. So these techniques are very interesting. And I think that we have to remember that Russia, unlike the other countries, had huge experience in spreading disinformation. And this, fake news thing and disinformation is very popular for about 10 years in Europe, or especially, let's say, in general in West. But it's just because there are new ways to spread disinformation. We have different means of communication, especially here, internet platforms like social media that allows us to spread in an incredible pace and it's relatively inexpensive way of spreading disinformation on a mass scale globally. So it's a completely new environment, but different methods and narratives are much older than that. And Russia is practicing disinformation actually this let's say that since Soviet times at least, but we can also refer to things like Potemkin villages in 18th century. So we had that Russian type of propaganda. We had different information warfare actions that were taken by Ochrana during the Tsar's time. So it's a very old tradition, but institutionally we have continuity since Soviet times, and Soviets were very skillfully using weaknesses of the Western societies. And by weaknesses, I mean here, for example, freedom of speech. That is, very at the core of our values and our political system. It's, from their perspective, one of the weaknesses. Without freedom of speech, we can't spread. They wouldn't be able to spread this information in our societies. So um, this is what is very particular about Russian disinformation. This huge tradition and knowledge how to use different gates that are built in our system.
So, if it's so old, how is it possible that not just maybe as the societies, but also as the political systems, we were somehow not able to somehow, protect ourselves? Well, I would say still the Polish society is quite, I think, still not the worst, because we have our history with Russia, which is quite harsh. So let's say people maybe are not that. Easy to be, used by this Russian disinformation, but there are still many societies that are quite an easy target. So how is it possible, if we know that this Russian disinformation is so old? How is it possible that we were not able somehow to protect ourselves?
Because it's not that easy. For example, in Poland, of course, it is very hard to spread this information that is showing that Russia is a great country and we should support them because they are on the right page of the history. But they can spread other types of disinformation, for example, causing misunderstanding between Poles and Ukrainians. Disinformation that is targeted at our relations within NATO or the European Union. That disinformation that is aimed at building mistrust for the army, for the Polish army, for example, and for government and for our institutions in general, for our system. So we have different targets here. It's when we had traditional media, it was very limited group of people that were taking care of the informations that were spread across the country, because we didn't have so many titles. I don't mean here Poland, because that's a different story, but Western countries. So if we had big titles, they had people who were specializing in in checking informations that were shown in these medias in order to avoid disinformation. Of course, it's not always easy to find one. Even if you are very, very careful, it's sometimes impossible to say if this is a real story or unreal, or if there is some manipulation behind it. So we have to be, honestly speaking, I don't think that at any point we will be able uh, to find out what is the disinformation and what is not. But we can be more resilient for these actions. I think that's
Mhm.
where we should aim.
Yeah, but how can we be more resilient? So should, for example, be there some like media literacy, maybe classes for, I don't know, primary schools, high schools, but I believe also the universities, because nowadays, as you also mentioned, we have all of those digital media. There is a huge digitalization, and people don't really tend to check any information that is visible on, I don't know, TikTok or on Instagram, and people are using it more and more often. So maybe this could be some kind of a solution. What do you think?
Well, the problem is we are overloaded with informations. So we are receiving so many of them, and some of them are important, and some of them are just trash. Mm, so that's the first obstacle. Second one is how to find out which one is real and which one is just some type of a manipulation operation. Uh, Definitely, media literacy classes, or the classes where kids are taught how to think in a critical way on this, on the sources or informations they are receiving. That's definitely a good idea. At least to show them that there is something like disinformation, that they are possible victims of these actions that are targeted by evil people who want to, use them, want to manipulate them to gain, their targets, which are against the national security of our countries. So it's that's, I think, one of the best ways how we can tackle disinformation. Others, like, these different fact-checking groups that are responsible for checking what is available in media, especially in, these internet platforms, that we have different information, articles, sources, and they are labeling which are which of them are, reliable and which are not. But this is also, affecting the way. In some way, it's affecting the freedom of speech in our country. So it's more delicate issue, I believe. And above all, we have also strategic communication, which is an old method, and this is our own narrative. And I think that West should develop more tools to spread this, to be able to face current challenges, and use this type of information warfare tools to be more resilient for these Russian, and not only Russian actions, because Russia is
Yeah,
only one of the actors we are facing here. And this is not only about, big countries; it's also about some Muslim extremists and others that are targeting Western populations to achieve different goals that are absolutely against our national security.
yeah, totally agree. I totally agree, especially with this third point, because somehow, even though we are powerful as the EU, especially, but somehow we are not able to somehow spread our own narrative anywhere in the world. I mean, we have the narrative, but if we'll be talking mainly about the European values, I think we will be not, treated as very important players on the global scale. But let's go a little bit. Yeah, yeah,
But it has to be
you
not
want.
only on the European level; it has to be also on the national level, because one of the Russia wants to cause polarization in our societies. And they are quite successful at that. Not only because they are so great, but because the nature of social media, these the mechanisms that are used in these platforms, where the attention of the users is the biggest value. You want to have these attention, you want to be shocking, you want to build, use emotions, and these emotions are causing fractures in society. And we have problems like in Poland, or like in the United States, or like in many other places where we are facing a huge polarization in society.
No, that's true. And tell me, regarding the Russian disinformation, do you see any significant changes, how their narrative has changed in comparison to the beginning of the war or even before the war, and how does it look like right now? So I believe maybe some objective has changed and they are using different kind of narratives. What do you think?
I think that there are many narratives that are old and were used for some time. For example, that Ukrainians are Nazis, or Ukraine is a fallen state, that they are not worth supporting, that they are going to lose anyway, so it's just a waste of money. Other old narratives like that is showing that Russia is a conservative empire that is, countering the rotten West, and that they want to spread the conservative values across the globe. So that's these sort of narratives are quite old. Also, any narratives that are targeted at NATO unity, that are trying to show that the United States are using European countries in their interest, and they are abusing this special position that countries like Poland, for example, are traitors of the Slavic people, and they are paid by the United States for that treason. So we have they these narratives in many ways were developed before the war because this war is happening since 2014. We have to remember that this war is hasn't started almost 2 years ago. That this war is lasting for some time, and they had enough time to build these narratives that they are using currently. Of course, there are different ad hoc uh, situations where they have to modify them or build some specific narratives, but in many ways these are old narratives that are quite useful in current situation.
And do you think they are successful with this kind of narratives?
Well, let's look at countries like Slovakia or Bulgaria. These are the most pro-Russian countries, societies in Central and Eastern Europe. And the people in these countries were voting for parties that are strongly against Ukraine, that are in many ways friendly to Russians. So we can see that there are places where this narrative is working. When we think about the United States and their problems with support for Ukraine, and it's also showing that there are that Russians are quite successful. Of course, it's not only that Russians are so powerful that they can do whatever they like and they can influence everything and the policy in these countries, but they are one of the factors that are building the situation, the political situation that is not in favor of supporting Ukraine, but especially when we compare it to the 2022 and the current situation. We have to say that this support is going to be weaker than it used to be, and that's not a good news apparently. Also,
So
we
you
have
mentioned.
other regions, for example, all these countries from Sahel, where we could witness people on the streets with Russian flags in Africa. So it's not only Europe or the United States, there are many other places where Russia is successfully selling its narrative against the West and against Ukraine. So that's quite worrisome.
Yeah, totally. And you have just mentioned Slovakia. But do you think that the Russians were trying to influence, or maybe tried to influence the elections in Poland, for example, or maybe in other also countries? You mentioned Slovakia, but what do you think? We just had elections in Poland, so it's still like a fresh news, time of transformation. So what do you think?
I mean, they were some groups that were spreading disinformation about NATO, that was spreading disinformation about Ukraine and Polish-Ukrainian relations, and so it was affecting the elections in Poland. But let's say that Polish politics is it's a bit different because all main political parties are, when we mean international policy, more or less similar. Of course, there are differences, especially when we think that policy towards, for example, Germany or the European Union. But when we mean security and Russia and the war in Ukraine, all main political parties are more or less holding the same position. So even though there were some Russian actions, I don't believe that they had a huge impact on the final result of the elections because there were absolutely different topics that were consuming the uh, attention of the voters.
Yes. Well, yeah, the election time was very interesting in Poland, very vivid. There were many different kind of narratives, but that's a topic for another discussion. But there are also another elections coming up, quite important one, especially I think from the perspective of Ukraine and Poland. So the elections in the US. Do you think that Russia will try somehow to also put some narratives that would be in favor of their position rather than Ukraine?
Definitely, there is no doubt that they will. They tried it in previous elections, so now the situation is even more important for them. And it will be not that they will say that, oh, we will spread the disinformation that Russia is great and it's a wonderful country. They will support the narratives that are in favor of isolation. Damn it! Sorry for that. For the policy that is aiming at keeping the U.S. interests in the U.S. and not being very active in NATO, not being very active in Europe, because it's not in favor of the American citizens who have their own problems, huge economic, social problems, and they should focus on that, not on the war in Ukraine or in other places in the world. Um, so I think it will be going that way. And it will be also about spending public money on other countries when, in the same time, Europeans are not willing to spend their own money on, for example, building up the armies and building up the military potential, even though they are facing this Russian threat directly. So,
Mhm.
the problem with these narratives is that there are some serious problems in the United States. There are some structural problems, economic problems, social problems, and that European countries are really not spending enough money on their own security. So, and that's the problem with this information, that it is always based on some real problems or emotions, topics. So, and that's also the case here, and that's not the good news for Europe, especially for the eastern flank of NATO, where we are relying on American support, American activities in our region, and
Mhm.
the armament and the troops. So that's a huge topic, I think, and it's very
Yeah.
hard to influence the American policy from the perspective of Central and Eastern Europe. So we are facing very challenging times here.
So my very last question to you would be, do you think that EU is actually considering such situations that actually US will say, hey guys, maybe you should deal with the war in Ukraine on your own because we also have other problems, because there can be some shifts looking at the geopolitical tensions. Maybe there will be Taiwan, the Indo-Pacific. What do you think? EU is taking such scenario into account, and if not, maybe they should. I mean, us.
I think that there are people in the European Union that are taking this scenario very seriously into consideration, but frankly speaking, Europe has no one voice when we mean war in Ukraine and support for Ukraine. And last week, we could witness, for example, that Hungary had completely different point of view on support for Ukraine. So I think that we should build, first of all, unity in Europe when we mean support for Ukraine. And we should make this support that we already promised more effective. And the promises made by the European Union in the last 2 years, for example, the ammunition supplies, we haven't kept that promise. So if we are, ourselves not doing what we promised to do for Ukraine, how we can expect the United States to be more active? How we could expect the Americans to be more supportive for Ukraine if this is our problem in the first place, not there? So that's very challenging situation here, and of course, it's the most important thing is how the main powers in Europe will act. For example, France or Germany. And outside the European Union, we can say that Great Britain is the United Kingdom is a great example of how we should support Ukraine. And next to the United States and countries like Poland or Baltic states, I think the United Kingdom is one of the best examples of the countries that were quite effective in supporting Ukraine with their equipment, with money, with all what is needed there on ground to defend them, to defend Ukraine from the Russian aggression. And the situation is going to be harder and harder, and yeah, it's very challenging now.
All right. Thank you very much, Pavel, for this extremely interesting conversation. We're living in challenging times, but I hope we will be able to find some kind of a common voice in the EU. Also, many thanks to Visegrad Fund for supporting our project on Russian disinformation. And I also would like to take this position to wish our viewers Merry Christmas. Christmas is coming, so I'm wishing you family Merry Christmas. Thank you very much once again.
Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. I think that, I hope we will overcome these difficulties and it won't be as bad as we were discussing today. So
Yes,
we should be,
we need. Yes,
there is some hope.
there is, of course. Thank you very much and have a good evening. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.